Help protect us from racism and xenophobia by becoming an I Love Black People ambassador today. Join on iloveblackpeople.com. No matter where you are in the world, join us today and get access to the I Love Black People network. Special thanks to Banneker Communities.
All right, and welcome to another edition of I Love Black People. And we've got someone who's always been helpful and supportive of I Love Black People and does so much. And we're just grateful for her and all the work she does. And we have our good sister, dear sister, Dr. Tyrene Wright. Thank you. Welcome Black to I Love Black People.
Thank you, Sinclair Skinner, for inviting me back. I
Well,
appreciate you.
could you look? I know you don't need no introductions. Always do, but just give us a little background and let us know what we're going to be talking about today, because I know you got so much to help us better understand this world.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about just some of the
Oh, no,
issues.
you got to tell them how wonderful you are and all the wonderful things you do. They got to
Okay,
know
so what do you know? You want to
you.
know that I teach for the City University of New York. I'm also an author of a book called Booker T. Washington in Africa, The Making of a Pan-Africanist. I produced radio for many years in WBAI, 99.5 FM, Pacifica National, on and on and on. Okay. Um, but what I'm going to talk about today are just some of the things that are connected to the Reconstruction Amendments, which still impact how we navigate modern day society and the legislation and constitutional rights that we're able to access and invoke. Okay. So that's the main
And it's
conversation
connected,
today.
to reparations.
Oh, of course, definitely connected to it. It does intersect with our conversation around reparations in America for slavery in particular, right? Because there've been reparations for other things in this country, but never for enslavement of African people. So, what I wanted to start with is just the fact that, and this kind of goes back to the Du Bois conversation. What was Du Bois up in arms about? He was up in arms about these three amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And he was essentially arguing that they had to be fully invoked because those were written in our blood. Those amendments come out of the Black or the African freedom struggle here in this country. And we had spilled our blood to get those Reconstruction Amendments. And it was our right here in this country, not only as human beings, but now as citizens as a result of those amendments. So, just briefly, because people always think that they know, right, of what, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Well, let's just revisit what some of them are specifically, right? So the 13th Amendment was passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, and it was ratified on December 6th, 1865. And that is the amendment that changed a portion, well, what amend the Constitution and would end slavery, right? So Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And everybody knows the film 13 and that little clause, right? The incarceration is a gateway to slavery. And then there is the 14th Amendment, which is really the conversation we're going to have today. Loosely is called naturalization, right? And it gave full access to the Constitution. So the 14th Amendment was passed in June 13th, 1866. It was ratified July 9th, 1868. And I'm giving the dates for a reason because a lot of people think that 13, 14, 15 came together. They were years apart, right? 13th was 1865, 14 was 1866, and was ratified in 1868. And the 14th Amendment changed a portion of Article 1, Section 2 of a portion of the 14th Amendment was changed by the 26th Amendment. So in other words, this amendment All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. In other words, no state can violate your constitutional rights. So no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. It's very important, right? Okay, that's the money amendment right there, in the sense that this is the amendment that gives you full access to the American citizenship, to the American experience, to the so-called American dream. And no state can violate those constitutional rights. They cannot create laws to violate those constitutional rights. And so any person born in the United States, this was a way to take the formerly enslaved population and make them fully citizens of this country, giving them all the freedoms that are provided for by the Constitution. Even the language is there: life, liberty, and doesn't say pursuit of happiness, but life, liberty, or property, right? And then there's the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which is directly with regard to the to voting, right? It was the amendment that allows or affords African people who were formerly enslaved in the United States to vote, right? Passed by Congress February 26, 1869. So once again, all years apart. Ratified February 3rd, 1870. And so it says, the first section, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And we know that in the United States, there were issues around that, grandfather clauses, when people wanted to go vote. Did your grandfather vote? Well, clearly not. If you were a formerly enslaved person, your grandfather was in bondage, enslavement. So of course he did not vote. Okay. And that amendment even though it doesn't add any, well, you notice it doesn't say anything about gender, because it is specifically for the formerly enslaved population, but the males specifically, right? Although this never becomes an issue at the time, because our community, the Black community at the time, understand that the enfranchisement of Black men meant enfranchisement for us all, essentially, right? So you saw women and men participating in the process of organizing people to facilitate voting during these radical Reconstruction years. But the amendment I wanted to talk about is just the main one, 14th Amendment, which allows naturalization. Everybody who comes to this country after this period and obtains citizenship, or anyone who comes to this country and has a child in this country, whether they're a citizen or not, because of this amendment, that child is naturalized. It is a citizen, right? And some people have some weird views and ideas about coming to America and having a child, and now the child's a citizen and that they won't separate them. We know from the Trump administration and all this kind of stuff, your child could be a citizen and you could possibly not be a citizen, and they would have no problem separating the two. That being said, much of what we do in a contemporary sense around fighting for rights, voting rights, still is an issue in numbers of states. They've engaged in coding language. They have done things to curtail voting rights in various states, right, with ID and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is that throughout our freedom struggle here in the United States, really all that ever needed to be done legislatively was to invoke this 14th Amendment, which gives us all access to all the freedoms provided for by the United States Constitution. Okay? But there's been a peculiar situation here. We have the Voting Rights Bill, Voting Rights Act 1964, 1965, which has a lot of little caveats in there for this group or that group. But really, it was to stop individual states from violating our rights to vote, right? Which we know from the 15th Amendment is illegal. And once again, that could be invoked. But the 14th Amendment provides all the freedoms, the right to have property, the right to, protection of our lives, the right to education, the right to equal services that are provided for by the state and or federal government. And so we have spent a lot of time trying to get extra acts and the Voting Rights Act had to be re-voted on or recertified a few years ago in around 2012 or 2011, or I'm sorry, a little earlier than that, 2010. However, the problem with that is none of those things should have to happen for rights of any kind to not be violated by the state or by any other entity, okay, or extension of the state. And so I think that this is something that when people who would consider themselves this new wave of white nationalism in America, when they want to challenge things, one of the things that is readily attacked is this 14th Amendment. Even the Trump administration was talking about, we want to reverse the 14th Amendment. Why? Because it's a powerful amendment in the sense that it gives you all of the access a citizen and all of the protections that a citizen is afforded in this country. Okay? And so, but there's much trepidation and a lack of understanding around that, right? Even when we advocate or engage in advocacy around legislation, right? There shouldn't have to be laws that specifically, protect our lives, in particular, Black people, right? So the Emmett Till act that came out, or they were trying to push, even the George Floyd piece of legislation that will force officers to do certain things. The reality is that white Americans never have to have additional legislation in order to invoke or protect their constitutional rights. And we know this. How do we know this? Because there are very few on record. If anything, the legislative process for them works in a way where it extends additional rights, but it doesn't double down and reinforce protections of already existing rights, ones that are in the Bill of Rights, right? The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and or others that come after that, or those that are naturally embedded in the Constitution. There is no such thing for them. They invoke the Constitution on the streets. You can't violate my, constitutional rights. However, there is a lot more distance between the Black person in America, the African person in America, and the Constitution, right? We don't seem to be able to directly access it, right? So this is also where affirmative action comes in at, how it was designed to address systemic racism, when reality, these amendments already address systemic racism, equal protection under the law, right? However, it's a conundrum for that, because affirmative action, we know, in trying to remedy systemic racism in institutions, turned around and was racist in nature. White women benefiting the most from affirmative action than Black people, right? And so this becomes problematic, but I think we've taken our eye off the prize, and our dialogue around this, what the 14th Amendment has done for people who came much later has been we don't have knowledge of, right? So we have a lack of knowledge around the fact that this amendment, equal protection under the law, has probably worked like magic for everyone but the people whose struggle it comes out of. That was a lot.
It's a lot, but I think you give a context that's not often given. And speaking to these additional laws, I saw even someone speaking to a group of people talking about reparations and our issues. And they were saying, oh, you need to sit down with the Congress members and talk to them and explain. And they even tried to intimate that, oh, no one's even bringing up issues of reparations. They're just talking about housing. And you need to get a consensus where any of these other demographics, be it based on orientation or religion, there's no consensus at. If you ask the people about the Ukraine and the billions of dollars that got sent, there's no consensus ever taken about all Americans thinking about that. But when it comes to issues related to us as descendants of enslaved African people, now, well, we got to make sure everybody's on board with this conversation when literally it's spelled out, like you said, in the Constitution already. Like literally, the Constitution say these things need to be done for these folks, and we're clear that the people who's, like you said, and you said it, I think the ending of it wrapped it up. The struggle that it came out of, the folks who are directly responsible for that struggle are the ones that don't benefit from it. And literally, the folks who actually created the struggle continue to double down on benefits that already are given and even maybe use it to expand or even come up with weaponized language to justify the wicked things they continue to do and have refused to stop doing.
Right.
So again, reverse discrimination. Like you'll hear these weird terms come out of some like thin air just because I'm white and I say so. And next thing you know, we're in this weird space having a conversation with a straw person that doesn't exist. There's no place where Black people are somehow taking the rights away from European Americans at all. Yet, there's a straw thing come up about us doing it, and we have to feel bad about it and ashamed. And I think that's one of the most wicked things they do. We're literally the ones that have been victimized, but then we must be ashamed of having the remedies. Like we did. If anybody should be ashamed, is those who are descendants of folks who would deny God's human rights and who've done all these putting hoods on their heads or standing by where there's two water fountains and folks picking who gets to drink out of what. Like whoever is descendants of those people should be shamed. But
Right.
yet, we're literally the victims of that, and then made the villain when we stand up and say, hey, this is not right. Well, why are you doing that? Well, you just trying to get a. Now I got to be ashamed for trying to give myself agency that's already in the Constitution. Hello. So I think what you said was, you gave, I did like a color commentary. You really gave like the factual pieces to it that make it make sense. So bring us up to date with that and kind of give us a context of where we are now with that backdrop.
Well, when we talk about contemporary issues, like some of the things that have gone on in Georgia, or some of the new laws that some states are adopting with regard to ID for voting, which is insane. The type of ID, right? These are things. These are some of the contemporary issues, but they ring of old in the sense that grandfather clauses, right? So we know you don't have this. For example, some states that are suspect with regard to this kind of behavior, have decided that you have to show a driver's license in a particular area. Well, what if the Black demographic overwhelmingly is not licensed to drive? Does that mean that they should not be able to vote? Well, of course not. What does driving have to do with voting? Nothing. Okay. But if you have to give a driver's license in order to vote, automatically that curtails who is actually going to access that process, the voting process, right? And so there's all kinds of sophisticated ways now that that are coded in order to violate the constitutional rights that of Black people, particularly, that were reinforced by these amendments. Okay, so notably the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, but also notably the 15th Amendment, which deals directly with, violating the rights of people for being Black, right? Race, color, being noted in the 15th Amendment as items that you cannot deny a person the right to vote. You cannot base denial of voting on those things. So we have contemporary issues like that, and that's something that you want to say, like, they wouldn't try that again, but yes, they are trying it, right? So these are some of the contemporary issues, but also too, and the larger issues when it comes to advocacy around protection of life. Once again, I mean, for there to even and we can't even go into this, and I won't, but even to get a Emmett Till anti-lynching law so many years after the death of Emmett Till, we're talking about just a particular understanding of protection of Black life in this country. Once again, provided for by the 14th Amendment, but we seem to have this distance between us and the amendment and then the Constitution in terms of access, being able to invoke these things. It should not have to be reinforced for any person who is born a citizen in this country to say that their rights should not be violated by way of taking their life. It's a no-brainer. However, once again, this group is not able to access their constitutional rights. and we know this because every day our constitutional rights are violated, either directly, right, or indirectly. So if you're talking about funding and housing in and of itself, off the bat, housing policy in this country up to now is still built around redlining and deciding who will be able to access funds to purchase a home and access ultimately wealth, right? But that has been done for white Americans, right? The white Americans historically got major grants to establish themselves, grants, financial grants, and land in the form of grants to access wealth in this country. Equal protection under the law should have provided that for African people in America or Black people in America who were formerly enslaved and started out with a disadvantage, a historical disadvantage. But nothing has been done to remedy these. So the idea is just forcing on the arguments that we present in contemporary times, forcing enforcement of these amendments that are written in our blood. And I'm not saying anything new. I'm just revisiting and reminding folks that we don't really need to reinvent the wheel. The wheel is already there. It's already been built by our ancestors and already fought for. And so we have to invoke those things and enforce that issue, because it further sort of to create little acts and sort of further and advance the idea that we don't have a natural right to the Constitution. To create a Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965 to say, oh, we don't have to recite the Bill of Rights, or we don't have to recite some obscure piece of legislation or some obscure anything that they make up locally to have to create an act to stop us from doing that almost advances their illegitimate claim that we've got to perform in order to access the Constitution. No, you are born here. Your ancestors advanced this struggle. It's written in blood. You have access. So now fight for true access, not fight for an act that's going to stop them for creating things, right? Creating little racist policies, right? Like the grandfather clause, or just anything. If your grandfather couldn't write, then you can't vote. If your grandfather didn't vote, then you can't vote. On and on and on. And in terms of how we get to contemporary conversations about reparations, once again, this is not a hard thing in modern times, because we know that there are so many things. People use them every day to now find out their genealogy, to find out their ancestry here, there, everywhere. The Mormons have opened up their records. There are very sophisticated and detailed records in the United States and their institutions as it relates to enslaved persons in this country. Okay, I actually actively, as an educator, use a map that plots the course of various ships, and you can find out the details of the cargo. Okay, where they came from in Africa, where they docked in the Americas, how many people were on the vessel, on and on and on. And then once we're engaged in plantation reality in life, these are very detailed records in terms of who was there, because it is documented as property. So the reality is, when we get to a conversation around reparations and who should access the perpetual wealth of America.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wright. Thank you, Sister Wright. Thank you, wonderful Wright. And I know we're going to have you on here again. And as we always end this with, I am because we are. And I know I'm definitely me because of you. Thank you, Dr. Wright. Thank you, Tyrene. Appreciate
it. Thank you.
Help protect us from racism and xenophobia by becoming an I Love Black People ambassador today. Join on iloveblackpeople.com. No matter where you are in the world, join us today and get access to the I Love Black People network. Special thanks to Banneker Communities.